All right, well, welcome everyone. I am so excited to see you all here today. We do, for those of you who are coming in, we have a few more chairs that we're getting, about 10 more chairs, and there's also some seats close to the front if you want to come on in. So thrilled to see this wonderful turnout today for Jeff's presentation and for our talk together. We're calling this a day in the life. We do it once in the fall and once in the spring, and the idea behind it is just to kind of give you a sense of what a job is like in the real world, and in this particular case, it's a national park superintendent. So let me tell you about our guest today. Jeff Bradybaugh became the Zion Park superintendent in October of 2014. Before that, he was superintendent for Bryce Canyon National Park, where in addition to overseeing daily park operations, he was deeply engaged in transportation-related planning and partnership projects with nearby state, local, tribal, and federal agencies. In his current position, he is responsible for the overall maintenance of Zion National Park, all 150,000 acres of it, and how the park can receive visitors. In 2016, Zion National Park was the 6th most visited park and had a record-breaking 3.7 million visitors. His other work with the National Park Service has included positions in Arizona, California, Kentucky, and North Dakota, and he entered the National Park Service with training as a forestry technician and wildlife biologist. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jeff Bradybaugh. Yay!
Thank you.
We have water there for you.
All right.
All right.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for your time here today. Good morning.
Always a pleasure to be back at SUU.
Yeah, you were saying the last time that you were here was just a short while ago.
Yeah, a month or two ago.
Perfect,
Yep.
perfect. Well, I'd like to start the discussion by telling me a little bit about your educational background. I know that you have a bachelor's degree from South Dakota State University in wildlife and fisheries management, a master's degree in wildlife biology from New Mexico State University. Tell me a little bit more about your experience and how you came to those majors and what sort of got you involved in all this in the first place.
Well, I think I come from a family that enjoyed the outdoors and pretty much grew up in the outdoors in northern New York State, which might sound like an urban environment, but not where I grew up. Pretty much fields and forests, and we enjoyed all that. Snow belt in New York, so we're used to shoveling snow.
Did you always imagine leadership as being part of your path, or did that sort of come later?
Yeah, that kind of came later. I think, from my education and starting early on as a forestry technician and then getting more into wildlife biology, we always envision ourselves as the hands-on biologist, and whether those be deer or bighorn sheep or mountain lions, all those things sound great, and when you're in those positions, you think, God, those people that are superintendents and managers must be crazy. But as your career progresses, you kind of understand how you may be able to affect some of the things that you really care about in a leadership position.
Great. Well, we'll definitely get more into that as we sort of track your career. Did you have any early specialties in the biology realm that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, one of the things that I minored both undergraduate and graduate in range science. And so when I went to Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota, it's a prairie badlands park, and range management we usually think of more in terms of cattle, sheep, horses, and other livestock. But in fact, at Theodore Roosevelt Park, we were managing bison, wild horses, bighorn sheep, all those big critters of a wild type.
Oh.
And so being able to apply some of the concepts of range management was interesting in a national park setting.
So that was the South Dakota position, and you were in Wyoming also for some time? Is that
Wyoming with the Forest Service as a forestry technician, so I learned the fine points of timber production.
And so for our students, one of the things that I like to do with this is to kind of talk about those positions a little bit in case anybody's really interested in going that direction. What are those jobs kind of like on a day-to-day basis, if you could maybe kind of compare them a little bit?
Sure. Forestry technician, pretty much in the field every day, marking timber in terms of timber production, but doing other things as well, looking at wildlife habitat, doing archaeological surveys at times, surveys for old homesteads in the Black Hills of Wyoming and South Dakota, actually finding where pioneers had settled and understanding a little bit about the cultural setting there.
Oh, wow,
So,
great. And then back to that transition to leadership, was it a quick transition, or was it something that kind of evolved? You mentioned sort of wanting to make a difference. How did that start to change?
Well, that was one of the toughest choices in my career, and I think it is for many of us that go from a field position to a managerial or leadership position. So for myself, it was moving from being the hands-on natural resource specialist to managing a group of natural resource managers. So what we would in the Park Service call a division chief. So that's mostly managing the biologist, the archaeologist, the hydrologist, the geologist, all those ologists. And then that's kind of the introductory step toward leadership positions.
And also along those lines, what makes those positions on a day-to-day basis different? I mean, is it, I would imagine, much more meetings, much more time at the computer? And so again, for students kind of looking at their sort of career trajectory, any personality traits or things that you found in that adjustment?
Yeah, I think it's more administrative for sure. It's dealing with personnel management, budgets, all those kinds of things, but still having some hands-on with the resource. That's the important thing. I've never wanted to work in a regional office or the Washington office, although I've done stints there for several months at a time. But having the hands-on, or at least the opportunity for hands-on in the park, is really important. So for me, that step was pretty dramatic, and takes a little getting used to, and in learning patience, because you're not the one that's actually carrying out the work, but you're accomplishing things through the folks that you work with, and takes a little bit longer sometimes.
Yeah, right. Can you tell us sort of the breadth of the position of superintendent and what all that entails? And I know some people are curious how much of the budgeting aspect, how much of all the different things that sort of fall under your purview.
Yeah. A good-sized national park is like a small city. We have all functions that a small city would have. So for example, at Zion, we have law enforcement rangers and emergency medical technicians, so we handle the emergency services, structural fire, wildland fire. We have all the utilities. So we have a facility maintenance division, and they have electricians and plumbers and all that. And we manage water systems and all those kinds of things. And we have our resource management group, again, the biologists. We have our Ranger Corps that engage with the public, do education programs with schools, that work with visitors that come to the park. Just a full range, and we have an administrative division because, after all, we are part of the federal government, so there's going to be paperwork. Yeah. And they work very closely on budgeting, personnel management, IT, all those kinds of support services for the field personnel. So we cover everything.
And do you does that whole, I mean, does that group meet only, I mean, do you ever have big meetings with everyone, or is it all pretty departmental? I mean, do you bring everyone together at any time?
Yeah, a few times a year we have a meeting, all employee staff meetings, and we talk about issues that are pervasive across the park that we're all trying to deal with. We have a management team that meets every week, and those are the division chiefs and myself.
Yeah, wow. How do you prepare? Because I know you, of course, knew Zion very well because you had worked there before, but what kind of preparation for your current position? I mean, did you take some time to just, I mean, I imagine the learning curve is pretty big.
Yeah, it varies from park to park, you know, and some parks are what we consider, you know, operationally more or less complex. And Zion's kind of more on the complex scale. It's probably, well, it's certainly not as complex as Grand Canyon or Yellowstone, but complex nonetheless. So what we tend to do as people evolve in their careers is not try to jump folks from a less complex to a very complex situation. So I've had the opportunity to work as a superintendent at several parks, kind of leading up to Zion. Every one of them was complex in their own way. I mean, they're all unique and have different issues and different concerns.
When you come in as a superintendent, do you come in with any sort of platform or goals specific to your term, or is it just you take everything in? How does that work?
It depends. Sometimes, you know, parks are facing particular issues, and as you come in, you inherit those, and some develop while you're there. And for us at Zion, one of the big issues is visitor use management, and we've had an incredible increase in visitation over the last 6 years or so. And so we really had to kind of start getting our hands around how do we manage that visitation. I would reference the slide on the screen right now. This is the mission of the National Park Service as established by Congress in 1916. And as you know, we celebrated our centennial in 2016. But the highlighted words are very important. Our mission is first and foremost to conserve the resources. And if you look at how the Congress worded this mission, what we call our Organic Act, it was very future-oriented. We're going to conserve. Well, when you conserve something, you're looking to the future. We're going to take care of these things in an unimpaired condition, which means that we're looking for them to last for a long time. And then we're talking about future generations. So all those things point to the future. And so our mission in the National Park Service is actually one of perpetuity. Mm-hmm. And so you'll often hear that folks say that parks are forever. Well, indeed, that's how we have to manage both the resources and the visitor experience. So we want folks to have an exemplary national park experience. At the same time, we have to provide the facilities, we have to make sure that the natural resources and the cultural resources are protected in the course of doing that. So that's one of the things, that's our struggle right now.
Yeah. You said a very powerful thing in the class visit this morning, and it was about the difference between preservation and conservation, and that you feel particularly strongly about both, but conservation, and I imagine that leads to the future. Could you talk a little bit more about your feelings and approaches to that?
Yeah, I think our mission, as stated here, is a conservation mission, and preservation is important. But we also, particularly important with cultural resources. And when I say cultural resources, I'm thinking about historic structures, archaeological resources, things that are generally not renewable. You know, when we think about the biological world, plants and animals reproduce, so they're renewable resources. So preservation really does apply particularly to our cultural resources. I look at conservation being particularly applicable to our natural resources that have the capability of replenishing themselves. And so it's an important distinction. And when we think about conservation, we need to think about this as a systems approach. So there's air, water, plants, animals, geology, soils, and all those things constitute the ecosystem or the environment of the park. And cultural resources also play into that because man has manipulated landscapes over time. And so we have to think about a systems approach, which I think conservation lends itself to.
And then you touched on this a little bit just a minute ago about some of the issues that either you inherited or are particularly resonating right now, and certainly overcrowding and population and that. And I know we talked a little bit about that this morning, but maybe for this audience, could you talk about that issue and what you're doing and what your people are doing to address it?
Sure. I'm going to attempt to change a slide here, so we'll see if that works.
Yeah.
Perfect. So this is a complicated graph. And it's data up through 2016. But what this graph shows is how our visitation has changed over the last little while. And for purposes of this demonstration, we're thinking about 2010 as kind of our base year. That was the year where visitation had gone up a little bit, but hadn't started going up dramatically. It was also kind of the height of our funding. And so we look at that as kind of the base year. So if you look at this graph, you can see that our visitation has increased significantly. And it's increasing in the summer, which you would expect. That's the popular time to visit. But look on the two wings, and the spring and the fall.
Oh, yeah.
Those are actually going up faster than the summer. Summer's still going up, but the fall and spring are going up faster. And that has a lot of implications. We are changing the way we manage the park to deal with some of those changes. For example, we used to start the shuttle system in Zion Canyon at the beginning of April. We'll now start it on Saturday.
Oh.
And as these shoulder seasons, as we call them, have broadened out and become more popular, we're having to run the shuttle more. We have to try to staff for those situations, that sort of thing. And that is expensive. So we're spending $1 million more operating the shuttle system in 2016 than we did in 2012.
Oh, wow. That's
well,
huge.
even 2013.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So visitation in 2014 and 15 increased by more than 1.1 million visitors. So these are very rapid changes, and it's very hard to adapt because our facilities are somewhat static. You know, our staffing is definitely static. I'll try this again. That's just some of the lines we see once in a while. And, you know, people park creatively, which does have impacts because it can damage facilities and resources. And we also get some very sensitive locations. The Virgin River, this is the entrance to the Narrows. The Virgin River is home to several species of fish, which are managed under a conservation agreement rather than being listed as threatened or endangered. So the conservation agreement, we have an obligation to protect, conserve those fish and their habitat. And we have some great concerns when we pack a lot of people into a very small area with a sensitive species. We also have issues in the river with human waste and other concerns, again, when we put a lot of people in a sensitive environment. But this is something, going back to, I was talking about staffing and funding and those sorts of things. So the red line is our increase in visitation through 2016. I haven't gotten the 2017 data there yet. And the blue line is our appropriated funding from Congress.
Oh, wow.
So you can see that there are some issues there.
Some, yes.
So when our budget is static or even declining, obviously the cost of business goes up every year. And so we're trying to adapt by shifting staff and doing other things, and that results in taking away from some parts of the program that are very important. And that concerns us greatly. So really, we're shifting our staff toward, visitor safety, visitor management, facility management, those kinds of things. And what's being impacted are the visitor programs and even some of the natural resource and cultural resource conservation work. So this is a big concern for us.
Would you say it's the largest concern right now for Zion?
It definitely is the largest concern right now. Again, we want visitors to have an exemplary experience, a national park experience. So we want folks to, hear and see the sights and sounds, the wildlife, the cultural resources that can be found in the park. And often when we have crowded conditions, that's very difficult to do.
And this is not a new problem. It's certainly exacerbated now. And I know that you had some great success with some of the adjustments to the backcountry use. Not to allude to that is what's necessarily going to happen, but could you maybe share how the park handled the backcountry overpopulation?
Yeah. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, we had a great increase in backcountry use. And we went through a process to establish what the capacity in the backcountry would be. And we set standards with indicator resources and thresholds by which we could measure whether those wilderness qualities or that wilderness experience or that wilderness resource was being diminished or negatively impacted. Once we have that data, then we can shift. How many permits might we have for the subways experience? How many backcountry camping permits in a certain location? Those kinds of things. So that has worked very well, and certainly as the use in the park overall has increased, so has it in the backcountry. But we have a system in place whereby we can adjust the numbers.
And it sounds like it has been quite a successful initiative.
It has.
Great.
It has, yeah.
And then right now you're kind of currently assessing or bringing the information together. Is that the stage of the process that you're in for the front country experience?
Exactly, yeah. We started about 2 years ago to begin looking at this issue and collecting the data and doing several studies on visitor use, on transportation. We have a multivariate model that we've concocted with a contractor that deals with transportation management, whereby we can vary 10 different variables, such as the number of shuttle buses operating, or how frequently they operate, or how many parking spots we have in Zion Canyon, all these things, and predict where the downstream effects are going to be, and will they be significant or insignificant. And so that's helping us understand what the capacity is in Zion Canyon. And it's also helped us understand that we really can't build our way out of the problem, that we're going to have to manage the number of visitors. Because we can add parking, but you run that through the model and there are just all these cascading effects to visitor experience, trail crowding, and different things that aren't meeting the desired conditions, which were laid out in our 2001 General Management Plan.
It's just not as simple as adding more parking places.
Right.
Is there, I imagine this process will take some time. Is there a certain timeline that you're working? Is it 5 years out we'll start seeing some change? You maybe can't say, and that's of course
Yeah.
fine.
Well, we're working on this plan, and we hope this coming winter, late fall, winter, to produce what we call a draft plan and environmental assessment. And that will be, that draft will be available for the public to review and provide us comments and say, you know, hey, we don't think this is the change you should make, or they may ask a question, well, what is this based on, you know, what's your data, whatever. So that's what we're doing right now, is trying to assemble what we call a preferred alternative for that draft plan. And that's taking all this information, all the studies that we've collected, and pulling it all together.
Oh, interesting. So we'll be on the lookout.
Yes, please.
Are there any other topics? They don't have to necessarily be challenges, but are there any other topics or issues or things that are particularly unique to Zion that you have been experiencing?
Well, one of the things that's not particularly unique to Zion, but I just want to point this out. One of the big issues around the National Park Service and trying to be addressed in Congress is what we call our deferred maintenance. This is the backlog of maintenance work that needs to be done on our facilities, whether they're visitor centers, trails, water systems, whatever it might be. And this is a growing problem, and you can see by these diverging lines, similar to the visitation graph, is that we're not able to catch up. And it's not only a funding issue, but staffing as well. And so we're trying to take about half of the of our revenue from our entrance station fees and that sort of thing and apply it to this problem. Because for Zion, our backlog of maintenance is $60 million.
Wow, that's a lot.
That's a lot.
You mentioned the revenue, and you did such a great job of sort of breaking that down. I know a lot of people have the question of where does our entrance fee go, and maybe if you could share that with us, that would be great.
Yeah, so the entrance fee that you may pay when you come to the park gate, there's a $30 fee for 7-day pass. 80% of that stays in Zion National Park. 20% of that goes to a national pool for parks that don't charge fees. Some parks, by legislation, don't charge fees. So we keep 80%. 75% of that funds the shuttle system.
Wow.
And that's over $4 million.
That's
Of the remaining, we take about half, 55% of that, and apply it to this deferred maintenance issue.
yeah.
And then the remainder goes to other project needs or operational needs. The park newspaper, park brochures, SUU, IIC interns. I hope some of you are here today.
Yeah.
So we use those funds for some operational activities, but we're limited by law as to where and how those funds can be used.
I see. Getting back to the job, what is a typical, which I know that's going to be the first problem, what is a typical day in the life like for you?
A typical day is usually planned, and by the time I get to the office, the plan goes away. So there's always something going on. You know, for me, it is a lot of meetings and discussions on many of these topics, and you know, how are we going to address a particular issue? how are we going to fund the ambulance operation, for example. I mean,
Right.
there are all these things that come up and where we're manipulating these different fund sources in order to get those to work. But also one of the big important things for the park superintendent is our partnerships. Partnerships with our universities, partnerships with our communities. We have a great partnership now 80 years with the Zion Natural History Association, which just rebranded and reorganized as the Zion National Park Forever Project. And they help with providing especially funds for education for schools, both bringing schools to the park as well as our staff being out in the schools. And so that's these partnerships are absolutely key, and they're all over. Mm-hmm. Other federal agencies, state agencies, private organizations, conservation groups, you name it.
And these kinds of partnerships, there's a quote about you particularly from one of the articles that I read, that a consensus builder with external organizations and groups. So I think you in particular do such a great job with partnerships. How do you feel about that? Do you agree with that? Do you like that part? Is that one of the pleasures of the job for you?
It is a pleasure. I think, we have this calling card called Zion National Park or the National Park Service, and it opens doors for us. And these partnerships really help us achieve much of what we're doing in the park. For example, managing bighorn sheep. We're working with Utah Division of Wildlife Resources on those projects, and we actually in December caught some sheep, and we're helping out Utah in this case by moving sheep to one of their struggling populations. But at the same time, we're doing disease testing on our sheep and satellite collaring some of our sheep, because we have an issue as they range outside the park. They can get into areas where potentially they can pick up disease from domestic livestock. So that's a natural resource application. It's a partnership with UDWR that we've had for decades, and these projects come up periodically, and we just say, okay, who can we partner with?
That's a great one to know about. Are there any others that you've been a part of that maybe are less publicized that we may not know about that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I think the partnerships with the communities are really important, and whether it be the larger cities, St. George, Cedar City, Kanab, or the smaller towns like Springdale, working with those folks, everything that we do in the park affects them. I mean, we are a main economic driver in the area. Our latest studies show that our economic impact is about $333 million to communities within a 50-mile radius. But also the things that the communities do affect us. They support our visitors. We have water rights relationships. I mean, there's all kinds of things. So those partnerships are just really great. We're working on one right now on the east side of Zion National Park with several private landowners over there. And we're looking at how do we serve the visitors, but also how do they conserve some of their wonderful resources that are right on the boundary of the park, which helps us conserve ours. So looking at conservation easements and other things.
That's great.
Yeah.
Would you, is there, if I just asked you what is the very best part of your job, would it be that, or would it be is there something else that you love, just getting out in it?
Well, the best part of the job is when I do get out in the park, for sure.
And how often? Is that often?
It's not often enough, I'll say that. But just being in Zion and having the opportunity, and this is why I like working at the park level in the National Park Service, is we can go out the door and we can go check on an issue or a concern or go clear your head even.
Yeah.
So
How about the most challenging part?
I think the most challenging part is trying to balance all the things that we have to do. Obviously, we have a limited budget. We have limited staffing. It can wear on the staff when they're really, really working hard, and sometimes they don't have the resources they need. And so I feel that that's my responsibility to try to get them those resources, and we certainly work hard at doing that.
Right. I know you get some opportunities to talk to students. What are maybe a few things that you really think are important for students to know right now about Zion, or perhaps about the preservation and conservation of the natural world? Just kind of, if you wanted to get on your soapbox to students, this is what you should be doing, this is what should be, or anything you'd like to sort of share specifically with our students today.
Well, I think, you know, our world is challenged right now in terms of sustainability. We have water resources, we have air resources, we have agricultural production. We have to feed ourselves, all those types of things. And I think sometimes we think that those aspects of society are somehow separated from the natural resources. But indeed, they are the natural resources. That's where all these things we have come from. And so we need to think about, how do we sustain those resources? How do we use them wisely? How do we use them appropriately? How do we allocate those? You know, there's a role for places like national parks and national wildlife refuges and state refuges and all those kinds of things. But there's also obviously a role for agricultural production, those sorts of things. But we have some real challenges. And I've had the opportunity to travel some, and water is going to be one of the biggest challenges worldwide, both quantity and quality. And as we have a warming climate situation, that's going to be exacerbated. It's already an issue in many countries. I just got back from Myanmar in November, early December, and the challenges there are huge. And it rains a lot there. They have a lot of water. But water quality is a huge issue. It's beginning to affect their rice production, which is a huge issue in Southeast Asia. So these sorts of things, you know, we need to think about what are we doing locally, but what effects and how do we contribute to a national or continental or even a worldwide perspective.
So some specific suggestions may be to make sure we're using our reusable water bottles, for sure. I also am curious if you have an opinion on, well, I watched the Super Bowl and there was the Matt Damon water conservation, these kinds of things. Do you have an opinion on those? Should we be looking to trying to support or help? Is that a good idea, or should we be looking more locally, or all of the above?
Well, I think it's all the above, but we can have a very dramatic effect locally. I mean, these are the things that we control, the choices that we make every day. And we can also support national and international organizations, certainly, but on a daily basis, we're making the choice to make a particular purchase or to build a facility in a certain way. You know, our energy consumption, are we looking at technology to help us with that? Fossil fuel production is important, always will be, likely, but we have some alternatives now that we need to bring up to the fore I'm always thinking about, living in southwest Utah and looking at all those rooftops and why there aren't solar panels on.
Right.
So there are things that we can do, and there are choices that we make that can help.
Right, great. Any other specific suggestions for students, that changes that we can make in our day-to-day lives?
Well, I think the first thing is stay in school. Let me just say this, we need you. And I don't just mean the National Park Service, but as a society, we need you. We need you educated, we need your enthusiasm, we need your work in new technologies, be they in the biological realm, the IT realm, engineering, whatever it is. We have all these issues that confront us in our world and locally, and we need folks that have the education and enthusiasm.
You mentioned some of the sustainability, you mentioned that a little bit, and some choices that you can make with buildings and things like that. And I know that there are several choices that Zion National Park has made, and some of them I was aware of, and some of them, like the trom wall, I didn't know about. Could you maybe
Sure.
reiterate some of those?
Yeah, when we were designing how we were going to move people around Zion Canyon back in the late 90s, we looked at the shuttle system, which everyone is aware of, but we also built a new visitor center. And we designed that, the National Park Service, along with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Colorado. And the building is designed such that it takes advantage of sun angles during the winter versus sun angles in the summer. The trom wall is actually a wall that faces the south, and the overhanging roof is cut back so that the low angle of the sun in the wintertime exposes that wall to sunlight. The trom wall, inside of it, has a big copper plate. And so that wall heats up, that copper plate absorbs that energy, and then releases it as heat into the building. And then in the summer, the towers in the visitor center are just big swamp coolers. And so we actually cool the building using solar power and the swamp coolers and that sort of thing. So again, there are things that we can do, and people say, well, isn't that expensive? Not a whole lot more than a standard construction visitor center, but the payback on energy savings has been incredible over the years.
And the shuttles currently are on a propane system?
Correct.
But there may be some adjustments to that potentially?
Mm-hmm. Our shuttle system, the buses have been in operation since 2000, so they have 18 seasons on them, and we're actively working on securing funding and such to replace those, but they would be replaced with battery electric buses.
And what would be maybe the timeline you said, I think you mentioned?
Well, sooner the better. The issue is it's going to cost about $25 million. So, that's going to take some time, but we're pursuing grants and other revenue sources to try and do that. So we actually tested one of the buses last year. We'll be testing 2 this year. So we want to make sure that we get the number of trips on the shuttle bus correlated closely with the amount of battery that needs to be on board on the bus.
That's exciting.
It's very cool, yeah.
We had an interesting conversation when you first arrived this morning about international visitors to the park, and that you've seen some trends in that direction. And I wondered if you could maybe share some of those thoughts again.
Sure. Yeah, our international visitation has been going up along with overall visitation. Very interestingly, visitors from Asia, particularly China, that visitation's been going up dramatically. And the folks that track these things with the U.S. Travel Agency and such say we've only seen the tip of the iceberg. So there are a lot of people around the world getting out to see the world. And having done some of that myself, I think it's great. But those do add to some of our visitation levels that we need to consider and that sort of thing. And sometimes we can tell folks from different countries they have different ways of traveling. And so we can kind of characterize what month this is. Sometimes it's German month, sometimes it's French month. Just because of the culture or even the work schedule in some countries are different than the way we do things. So it's always interesting.
And certainly, the international contingent is part of the growing numbers, but what are your thoughts on the reasons for the drastic increase in visitation?
Well, I think overall, when we think particularly about domestic visitors, folks from the U.S., the economy has improved, certainly. Gas prices have stabilized some. I think certainly there's been marketing of the parks. And I think the biggest thing actually is social media. And when friends communicate or family members communicate, they're expressing the great time they've had at Bryce Canyon or Zion or Cedar Breaks or Pipe Spring or Yellowstone or what have you. And these are incredibly beautiful places. And I think that has really mobilized a lot of folks. The other thing, the baby boom generation, many of those folks are retiring, and they're retiring fairly well off, and they have the economic wherewithal and the time to travel.
Yeah. One more Zion-related topic, and then I have a couple of other questions. We sort of touched a little bit in some of the classes today about endangered species and how you handle those in the park. Can you share with us any particular species that are being treated a certain way, and also some of the other species that may be particularly unique to Zion or we should be looking at or be aware of?
Yeah, Zion is interesting, and most national parks have endemic species or other rare species of plants and animals and even bacteria and all kinds of things. These are unique environments generally, and so they have unique habitats. And in Zion, we have 40 species of plants and animals that are endemic to Zion or very, very close by. So everything from the tiny Zion snail that's only found in the hanging gardens to the threatened Mexican spotted owl. Spotted owl is an interesting case because Zion is actually a source population for Mexican spotted owls for the entire Colorado Plateau. And we know that because we've banded the birds and then have located them in other locations in New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, Utah, and that sort of thing. So it's very important that we track those populations and that we maintain that habitat, which makes them so productive in Zion that they're not a sink, in other words, absorbing, but they're producing.
That's fascinating.
It's cool stuff.
Yeah, it's really
As a biologist, that's cool stuff.
Just a few sort of personal questions about your travels and your perspectives. I know that you've mentioned a couple of very exotic locations that you have traveled, and as a biologist and in your particular situation, is there any extremely memorable place or place that you visited that had a major impact on you? Probably many, but
several. Yeah. I think one of the most impactful was Siberia.
Ah, really?
I had the opportunity to travel to Russia as a government employee and helping the Russian parks set up some visitor use, and some biological monitoring programs. And originally we were supposed to go, this was a number of years ago, we were supposed to go in July. I said, yeah, this is going to be great. And something happened diplomatically between the two countries, and it got pushed back. And I was traveling, or going to travel, with a professor from Northern Arizona University that had been doing some work over there for quite a few years. And he called me up and said, "Are you ready to go?" I said, "Well, yeah, I'll be ready. You know, spring's coming, whatever." "No, we're going in 2 weeks." And this was winter. So who goes to Siberia in the winter?
Not me.
But it was fantastic.
Oh, really?
We were in Kamchatka, if you know where that is. That's the far eastern end of Russia. You know, you can see it from Alaska. Sorry. But the Kamchatka Peninsula is a very wild place. And so we got to experience those parks on snowmobile and cross-country skis.
Wow.
And big geyser basins and all kinds of cool stuff. And so it was great to see the parks, but we were also there working with park staff and to develop these kinds of inventory and monitoring systems that they wanted to put in place, because under the communist regime, these national parks were more like research reserves. The public didn't visit them.
All right, that's what.
And so now, once the communist regime switched over, then these parks became places that people were going to. So they had all kinds of issues with helicopter skiing and all kinds of things that they'd never experienced before. So they were trying to get a handle on all that.
And you said this was some years ago. Do you have a sense of how those parks are doing now?
Yeah, I've kept in contact with a few of the folks over there, and they have implemented some of those things. But the advantage they had is that they got started very early. For us, like at Zion, we're kind of experiencing, okay, we're going to manage visitor use, but we've been around for 100 years.
Yeah, right.
So they got to kind of start off and do this in a more orderly manner, I guess I'd put it that way.
Interesting. Do you have anywhere that you've got your eye on that seems like you really would like to go and see what the scene is like?
Yeah, there's many places. Considering a trip to Bolivia next fall.
Oh, great. I always ask guests, either here or on the radio or in the music program, does anything come to mind as the best advice you were ever given? I'm thinking in terms of students, and is there anything that anybody ever told you that has stuck with you as being particularly memorable and particularly useful?
Yeah, I would go back to something my grandfather told me, which was that, if you're going to do it, then you go all the way. Just jump in with both feet. And he didn't put it quite that way, but that was the gist of it. It's more like go high or go home. That's the way he put it. But but that's what he was telling me basically was, if you're going to do something, go all the way with it, stick to it. He also said though that if it's not right, then just don't do it anymore. But he said, once you know what you want to do, then go for it.
That's great advice.
It is.
As we finish and close today, are there any other parting remarks or anything that we didn't touch on that you want to make sure to get it across to our audience?
Just that we've had a remarkable relationship, the parks here in, particularly in Southwest Utah, with SUU, and we have an agreement called an Alliance for Education, and we take that very seriously. SUU is University of the Parks. I hope you take that seriously.
We do.
We just really appreciate the relationship that we've had with faculty and many, many students that have worked in the parks, either on a summer basis or come and done a project with us or what have you. So Thanks, keep it up.
Great. Well, I'd like to, on behalf of everybody here, thank you so much for your time and coming down here and spending the morning with us. It was just really an honor to have you. I'd like to thank the audience for coming and showing up today and filling our room. That is absolutely wonderful. So we'll say goodbye here for the week, and we hope to see you back. We'll be in this room again next week with Claudia Bradshaw. And thank you so much, Jeff, for your time today.
My pleasure. Thank you.